The rain had not yet started when the city stirred awake that late autumn morning, but the gray sky over the harbor promised it would come before noon. In a narrow apartment above a shuttered bakery, Ethan Brooks opened his eyes at exactly 5 o'clock. The way he had done every single day since his years in the Navy had carved that habit into his bones. He did not need an alarm. His body simply knew. He rose from a mattress that had seen better decades, folded the thin blanket with the same precision he once used to fold a flag, and stood in the small kitchen boiling water for coffee he had already reused twice that week to stretch his budget a little further. The apartment held almost nothing of value, yet it was clean, orderly, and quiet, in a way that suggested a man who had made peace with having less. A single photograph sat on the windowsill, its edges softened by years of handling, showing a woman with a gentle smile who had once been his whole world before illness had taken her far too soon. Ethan looked at it every morning, not with sorrow anymore, but with a quiet nod, as though checking in with an old friend before starting the day. He dressed in the same faded jacket he always wore, laced up boots with soles worn thin, and stepped out into air that smelled of salt and diesel. The docks were already waking when he arrived, forklifts groaning, gulls circling above stacked containers, men shouting instructions across the wide concrete yard. Ethan worked maintenance for a mid-sized shipping company, the kind of job that asked for his hands and his patience but rarely his name. His supervisor, a sharp-tongued man named Ryan Cole, treated him the way some men treat furniture, useful but beneath conversation. Ryan handed him the worst assignments without apology, sending him into narrow engine rooms and beneath rusted platforms where younger workers refused to go, and Ethan accepted every task without complaint, because complaining had never once solved a problem in his experience. He had served 8 years in the Navy before an injury during his final deployment forced him into civilian life earlier than he had ever planned. And though the transition had been difficult, he never once spoke of those years with resentment, choosing instead to carry forward the discipline and loyalty that service had instilled in him. His wife, Sarah, had passed away nearly 6 years earlier after a long illness, leaving him without children, without extended family nearby, and without the kind of support system many people took for granted during hard times. He had grieved quietly, the way he did everything, refusing to burden others with his sorrow, and had rebuilt his life piece by piece around routine, discipline, and small acts of decency that nobody ever asked him to perform. Somewhere along the way, co-workers had started calling him the quiet sailor behind his back, half mockery and half something closer to respect they were unwilling to admit aloud. When an elderly dock worker named Walter injured his back lifting crates, it was Ethan who quietly finished Walter's shift without being asked, and without mentioning it to anyone afterward. When a new employee mixed up a shipment and faced losing his job, Ethan stepped in and corrected the mistake before management noticed, taking none of the credit and expecting none of the thanks. People often said Ethan Brooks was simply too good for a world that rarely deserved him, and they said it with a kind of sad admiration, the way people speak about virtues they wish they still had time for. By the time evening arrived that particular Thursday, something unusual had settled over Ethan. A small and stubborn decision he rarely allowed himself. He had counted his savings the night before, a modest sum built slowly over many months of sacrifice. And for once he decided he would spend a portion of it on something that was not a bill, not a repair, not an obligation. He wanted, just this once, to sit in a proper restaurant and eat a warm meal without calculating the cost of every bite. He told himself it was foolish, that the money could be saved instead, yet something in him, some quiet ache for a normal evening, refused to be talked out of it. He changed into his only decent shirt, the same one he had worn to his wife's funeral years earlier, and walked toward the address a coworker had once mentioned, unaware that this simple decision was about to alter the entire course of his life. Across town, in a tall glass building overlooking the same harbor Ethan worked beside every day, a very different life was unfolding. One built of boardrooms, private elevators, and decisions that moved entire industries. Victoria Sterling sat behind a desk, far larger than the apartment Ethan called home, staring at a city she owned pieces of without anyone on the street ever recognizing her face. She was 36 years old and had inherited an empire from her father before growing it into something even he had not imagined. Yet the wealth had never brought her the one thing she quietly longed for, which was the simple certainty that people around her valued her for who she was rather than what she controlled. Victoria had learned long ago that money changed the way people looked at her, softened their voices, straightened their spines, filled their mouths with flattery that meant nothing. So every few months, she disappeared from the polished world of sterling global holdings and walked into ordinary places as an ordinary woman, wearing plain clothes, carrying no bodyguards, revealing nothing of her identity. She did it not for entertainment, but because she needed, now and then, to remember what honesty looked like on a stranger's face. That evening, dressed in a simple beige coat and flat shoes, she left her penthouse without informing even her closest assistant, Olivia Grant, and walked several blocks toward a restaurant she had chosen at random, unaware that fate had already begun, arranging the pieces of a night neither she nor Ethan would ever forget. The restaurant Victoria chose sat near the waterfront, a place favored by wealthy businessmen who liked to be seen as much as served. Its interior gleaming with polished wood and low golden light. She took a seat near the window, ordered a modest meal, and watched the room the way she always did, quietly studying how servers were treated, how strangers spoke to one another, how quickly kindness or cruelty revealed itself in unguarded moments. She did not expect anything unusual to happen that night. She simply wanted a few hours of anonymity, in a life that rarely offered any. It happened without warning. A wealthy man at a nearby table, already several glasses into an expensive bottle of wine, gestured too widely while telling a story and knocked his drink directly across Victoria's lap and onto her plain coat. The stain spread instantly, dark and obvious. And for a moment, the entire section of the restaurant turned to look. Rather than apologize, the man laughed loudly and gestured toward Victoria as though she were the inconvenience, muttering something about clumsy people who did not belong in a place like this. His friends laughed along with him, and within moments, the restaurant manager appeared, not to assist Victoria, but to ask her, in a voice dripping with false politeness, to leave the premises so as not to disturb the other guests. Victoria said nothing in her own defense, not because she lacked the words, but because she wanted to see, without revealing her identity, how far this cruelty would travel unchecked. The manager repeated his request more firmly, gesturing toward the door, while nearby diners smirked and whispered behind cupped hands. Nobody moved to help her. Nobody questioned whether the well-dressed man who had actually caused the mess should be the one asked to leave. In that entire crowded, glittering room filled with important people wearing expensive clothes, not a single person was willing to speak a word of decency on her behalf, and Victoria felt, not for the first time, the particular loneliness of being surrounded by people who valued appearances over character. It was at that exact moment that Ethan Brooks walked through the restaurant's front doors, still adjusting the collar of his old shirt, arriving for the one indulgent meal he had promised himself after months of quiet sacrifice. He noticed the commotion immediately, the way a soldier notices disruption in a room before understanding its cause, and his eyes moved from the spilled wine to the stained coat, to the trembling composure of the woman standing near the window. He saw the manager gesturing toward the door, saw the arrogant man still chuckling with his friends, and something old and immovable rose up inside him, the same instinct that had once made him run toward danger instead of away from it during his years of service. Without hesitation, Ethan crossed the room and placed himself quietly but firmly between Victoria and the manager. And in a voice calm enough to cut through the noise, he said that if anyone in this restaurant needed to leave tonight, it certainly was not her. The room fell into a strange, uneasy silence for a heartbeat before laughter erupted, sharp and mocking, aimed directly at Ethan. Someone at a nearby table asked loudly who exactly this man in worn-out boots thought he was to be giving orders in a place like this. The manager, embarrassed and defensive, turned his irritation toward Ethan instead, informing him coldly that this was not his concern, and that men dressed the way he was dressed had no business interfering with paying customers. Ryan Cole would have recognized the tone instantly. The particular contempt reserved for people assumed to have nothing worth respecting. Ethan absorbed the insults without flinching, his posture unchanged, his voice steady, because he had faced far worse than mockery in rooms far more dangerous than this one. He turned to the manager and asked, plainly, what the total cost of the woman's meal and the damages to her coat would come to. And when the number was named with a smirk, clearly meant to humiliate him into silence, Ethan reached into his jacket and withdrew the folded bills he had carried that evening for his own long-anticipated dinner. It was nearly every dollar he had allowed himself to spend after months of careful saving. Money meant for a single, quiet evening of dignity, and he handed it over without a trace of hesitation. As though the decision cost him nothing at all, the restaurant fell silent again. This time not from mockery but from confusion, because nobody in that glittering room could understand why a man with so little would give away so much for a stranger he had never met. Victoria stared at him, stunned into a silence deeper than any boardroom negotiation had ever produced in her, because in that instant, she was looking at something she had almost forgotten existed, kindness offered with absolutely nothing expected in return. She asked him quietly why he would do such a thing. Why a stranger would spend money he clearly could not spare to defend a woman he did not know from people who mattered far more to his own daily survival than she ever could. Ethan looked at her evenly and answered in a voice free of performance, saying simply that the right thing ought to be done regardless of what it cost, because a man who only did right when it was convenient had never really done right at all. Victoria felt something shift quietly inside her chest, an unfamiliar warmth she could not immediately name, as she watched this stranger calmly pull out a chair and invite her to sit and finish her meal in peace. They sat together at her table, while the restaurant slowly returned to its noise, though quieter now, chastened by what it had just witnessed. Victoria, still concealing her identity, introduced herself only as a woman named Vicky, who worked in corporate administration downtown, and Ethan accepted this without suspicion because he had never learned to doubt people simply for being modest about themselves. They talked for nearly 2 hours, the conversation drifting easily from small pleasantries into something deeper. And Ethan found himself speaking about years he rarely discussed with anyone, describing the ocean crossings of his Navy service, the friendships forged in cramped quarters, far from home, and the men he had once helped pull from danger when everything could have gone wrong in an instant. He spoke, too, of the friends who never made it home, his voice lowering slightly but never breaking, carrying the practiced steadiness of someone who had long ago made peace with grief, without letting it curdle into bitterness. Victoria listened more closely than she had listened to anyone in years, noticing that this man, who possessed almost nothing by the world's measurements, carried none of the resentment she often heard from men who possessed everything and still felt cheated by life. He spoke instead of gratitude, for having served, for having survived, for having the chance to help a stranger in a restaurant on an ordinary autumn evening. Somewhere in the quiet space between his words, Victoria felt an admiration take root inside her that had nothing to do with wealth or power and everything to do with character, and she left the restaurant that night promising to see him again, though she said nothing yet of who she truly was. Over the following weeks, their conversations grew longer and easier, drifting from the ocean and the Navy into smaller, gentler subjects, the kind two people share only once. Genuine trust has quietly taken root between them. Ethan told her about Sarah without hesitation, describing the particular way she used to hum while cooking dinner, the stubborn optimism she carried even during her final months, and the strange comfort he still found in keeping her photograph exactly where she had once placed it herself. Victoria, in turn, allowed herself to speak more honestly than she had in years, describing the loneliness of inheriting more responsibility than affection, the exhausting parade of people who wanted access to her fortune while showing little interest in the woman behind it. She confessed, carefully and without naming names, that she often wondered whether anyone would still choose to know her if the money disappeared overnight. And Ethan answered without hesitation that character revealed itself only when there was nothing left to gain, which was precisely why he trusted so few people and valued so deeply the ones who had earned it. Their meetings became something close to a quiet ritual. Coffee near the harbor on Tuesday mornings, a shared bench overlooking the water on Sunday afternoons, conversations that never once touched on business or ambition, but circled instead around books, old films, and the particular resilience it took to keep believing in decency after loss had tested it so thoroughly. Victoria noticed that Ethan never once asked her for anything. Not advice, not connections, not even simple favors. And this restraint struck her as more remarkable than any gift she had ever received from men eager to impress her. She began to understand that his integrity was not a performance calibrated for her benefit, but a consistent, quiet architecture running through every part of his life, visible whether anyone was watching or not. In the days that followed, Victoria found small reasons to continue meeting Ethan. Arranging quiet coffees near the harbor under her assumed identity, always careful to keep her true name and position hidden from him. She learned that he lived simply not because he lacked ambition, but because he measured his life by different currency entirely. One built from discipline, service, and quiet acts nobody else would notice. Meanwhile, at the docks, the fragile piece of Ethan's ordinary life had already begun to crack beneath pressures he did not yet see coming. Charles Benton, the owner of a logistics company eager to sell his business to Sterling Global Holdings for an enormous sum, had grown desperate to secure the deal, and Ryan Cole, sensing opportunity in that desperation, began looking for ways to make himself indispensable to powerful men circling the negotiation. Ryan had never liked Ethan, resenting the quiet respect other workers occasionally showed him despite his low position. And when a valuable piece of equipment went missing from a secured storage unit, Ryan saw an opportunity too convenient to ignore. He quietly altered a shift log, suggesting Ethan had been the last person near the equipment before its disappearance, and whispered the accusation to management with practiced sincerity, framing himself as reluctant to report a coworker he supposedly respected. The company, eager to appear decisive and unwilling to investigate too deeply, suspended Ethan without pay pending review, offering him no real chance to defend himself against a story that had already hardened into accepted fact before he even learned he was accused. Word spread quickly through the docks, twisted further with each retelling, until men who had once nodded respectfully at Ethan now looked away when he passed, unwilling to be associated with a suspected thief, regardless of how quietly and honestly he had always behaved. Marcus Hale, an investor who frequently lingered around wealthy circles hoping to attach himself to profitable opportunities, heard of the situation through Ryan and suggested to Ethan, almost too casually, that admitting fault and apologizing might make the entire unpleasant matter disappear faster. Ethan refused instantly, informing Marcus that he would not confess to something he had not done merely to make other people comfortable, even if honesty cost him far more than a lie ever would. Ethan found the sudden silence from former friends harder to bear than the loss of income itself, since men he had helped over the years, men whose shifts he had covered without complaint and whose personal troubles he had quietly assisted, now crossed the docks, avoiding his eyes entirely, unwilling to risk their own reputations by association. Walter, the elderly dock worker whose back injury Ethan had once covered without asking for thanks, was the only person who still greeted him warmly, though even Walter admitted quietly that he could do little beyond offer sympathy, since his own position remained precarious enough without inviting further scrutiny from management. Ethan absorbed this isolation the way he absorbed most hardship, without complaint, though late at night, alone in his small apartment with Sarah's photograph watching from the windowsill, he allowed himself, just briefly, to wonder whether decency had ever truly protected anyone from the world's indifference. Unknown to everyone involved, Victoria had already begun quietly investigating the disappearance herself, using resources far beyond what anyone at the company realized she possessed, because something about the sudden accusation against Ethan felt engineered rather than accidental. Her private investigators uncovered surveillance footage the company itself had conveniently overlooked. Timestamps that placed Ethan nowhere near the missing equipment during the window in question, and digital records showing the shift log had been altered after the fact by someone with administrative access matching Ryan's credentials. Victoria said nothing yet, choosing instead to watch how far the injustice would be allowed to spread, and how the people around Ethan would behave once his usefulness disappeared and his reputation lay in ruins. What she saw disturbed her more than she expected, because the very people who had once relied on Ethan's quiet reliability now abandoned him with barely a second thought, proving once again how quickly convenience could erase gratitude in people who had never truly valued him to begin with. Within days, the company terminated Ethan's employment entirely, citing the unresolved accusation as sufficient grounds despite the absence of any formal proof, and Ethan found himself without income, without the modest security he had spent years carefully building, and largely without allies among people he had worked beside for years. His savings, already thin after his gesture at the restaurant, dwindled further as bills continued arriving regardless of his circumstances, yet even during this collapse, Ethan refused every suggestion that he simply apologize for a crime he had not committed. Ryan mocked him openly now, no longer bothering to hide his satisfaction, while Marcus continued offering hollow advice dressed up as concern, more interested in staying close to whoever might eventually hold power in the coming business deal than in genuine fairness. Victoria, watching this unfold from behind the calm mask of an assumed identity, felt something inside her finally settle into resolve, understanding that the time for quiet observation had ended and the time for action had arrived. She continued meeting Ethan during this difficult stretch, never once revealing her wealth or her true name, offering instead simple companionship and quiet encouragement, while she finished assembling the evidence that would eventually expose the truth. Ethan never suspected the woman he knew as Vicky held any power over his circumstances, and he never once asked her for help, because asking for help had never come naturally to a man raised to solve his own problems and shoulder his own burdens without complaint. Victoria found herself moved by this refusal to bend, this insistence on maintaining his integrity, even while losing almost everything else, and she recognized in him a kind of strength money had never been able to purchase for anyone she had ever known in her own world of privilege and calculation. It was during this period that Victoria understood, with a clarity that surprised her, that whatever she felt toward this quiet, principled man had grown into something far more significant than curiosity or gratitude, though she said nothing of it yet, waiting instead for the right moment to let the full truth finally surface. That moment arrived on the day Sterling Global Holdings was scheduled to finalize its acquisition of Charles Benton's logistics company. An event attended by dozens of executives, investors, and interested parties gathered inside a grand conference hall downtown. Charles stood near the front of the room rehearsing his opening remarks, confident the deal would close smoothly, while Ryan lingered near the refreshments table hoping to be noticed by someone influential enough to remember his name. Marcus circulated through the crowd offering handshakes and empty compliments, searching as always for an opportunity to attach himself to whatever success unfolded that afternoon. None of them noticed Ethan quietly enter near the back of the room, invited there without explanation by a message from Vicky, asking him simply to trust her and attend. A request he honored, despite his confusion, because trust, once given, was not something Ethan Brooks withdrew easily. The room quieted as the doors at the front opened, and Victoria Sterling walked in, no longer wearing a plain beige coat or flat shoes, but dressed instead in the sharp, commanding attire befitting the chairwoman of one of the largest holding companies in the country, flanked now by Olivia Grant, and a small team of executives who greeted her with the immediate deference reserved for true authority. Every person in the room rose to their feet almost instinctively, a ripple of recognition and sudden nervous energy sweeping through the crowd as they realized precisely whose presence they now stood before. Ryan's confident posture collapsed the moment he recognized her face, the very same woman he believed he had humiliated weeks earlier without consequence, and Charles felt his rehearsed remarks evaporate entirely as understanding settled over him with cold, sudden weight. Marcus stood frozen near the refreshments, his easy smile faltering as the pieces assembled themselves in his mind far too slowly to save him from what was coming. At the back of the room, Ethan stared at the woman now commanding every eye and every breath, recognizing her voice, her posture, the quiet strength he had come to know over quiet cups of coffee, yet failing entirely to reconcile this powerful figure with the modest woman he believed he had simply been getting to know. For a long moment he said nothing at all, his mind working through weeks of memory, now rearranged by a single revelation, understanding at last that the woman he had defended in a crowded restaurant The woman he had shared his deepest stories with was in fact Victoria Sterling herself, one of the most powerful individuals in the entire country. Victoria did not linger on pleasantries. She walked to the front of the room, thanked the gathered executives for their patience, and announced that before any acquisition would proceed, certain matters of character required addressing publicly rather than quietly. She gestured toward a large screen behind her, and with a calm, unhurried authority, revealed the surveillance footage her investigators had gathered, timestamps clearly showing Ethan far from the missing equipment during the relevant hours, followed by internal email correspondence proving Ryan had orchestrated the false accusation deliberately in hopes of currying favor with Charles during the acquisition process. The room absorbed each revelation in stunned silence, and Charles, visibly pale now, attempted weakly to distance himself from knowledge of Ryan's scheme, though further documents Victoria displayed made clear he had been informed of the fabrication and chosen convenient silence rather than confronting an uncomfortable truth. Victoria's voice remained level throughout, neither cruel nor triumphant, simply precise, as she explained that Sterling Global Holdings would not proceed with any acquisition involving leadership willing to sacrifice an innocent man's reputation and livelihood merely to smooth the path of a business transaction. She announced the immediate cancellation of the deal, informed Charles that his company would find no partnership with her organization now or in the foreseeable future, and directed her security team to escort Ryan from the building. His employment terminated effective, immediately given the documented evidence of his deception. Marcus, who had spent the entire meeting attempting to appear invisible, found himself quietly and efficiently removed from any future consideration for investment opportunities. Victoria's company might have otherwise extended him, a consequence delivered without spectacle, but understood by everyone present as final. Charles attempted one final appeal, reminding Victoria of the years his company had spent building its reputation, suggesting that a single lapse in judgment should not undo decades of otherwise honorable business practice, yet Victoria answered him without raising her voice or softening her position in the slightest. She told him plainly that a single lapse in judgment, when it involved deliberately destroying an innocent man's livelihood to protect a business transaction, was not a minor stumble, but a clear window into the values a company would carry forward into every future decision it made. Several executives in the room nodded quietly at this, recognizing in her words a standard they had perhaps forgotten to hold themselves accountable to, while others shifted uncomfortably, aware that similar compromises existed somewhere within their own histories, waiting to be discovered. Olivia Grant, standing near the front beside Victoria, later admitted to colleagues that she had never seen an entire room of powerful people grow so completely silent in the space of a single sentence. Security escorted Ryan from the building within minutes, his protests growing louder and less coherent the further he moved from the room, though nobody present offered him the sympathy he had once denied Ethan so casually. Charles remained seated for a long moment after Victoria finished speaking, his face carrying the particular exhaustion of a man watching years of ambition collapse under the weight of a decision he had convinced himself did not matter enough to refuse. Turning at last toward the gathered crowd, Victoria stated plainly that her organization chose to work only with individuals and companies who valued integrity above convenience, and the silence that followed her words carried more weight than any applause could have offered. Only then did Victoria walk toward the back of the room where Ethan still stood, his expression carrying no anger, only quiet disbelief and the particular vulnerability of a man realizing the woman he had grown to care for occupied a world entirely different from the one he understood. She approached him without the polished distance of a chairwoman addressing an employee, but with the same warmth she had shown him across countless quiet conversations weeks earlier, and she apologized for the deception, explaining gently why she had chosen to conceal her identity and how deeply his honesty had affected her throughout every single meeting they shared. Ethan listened without interrupting, absorbing the explanation with the same steady patience he brought to every difficult moment in his life. And when she finished speaking, he told her simply that he understood, because a person searching honestly for the truth about others often had to hide certain truths about themselves in order to find it. Victoria then extended an offer she had been considering for days, inviting Ethan to join Sterling Global Holdings in a newly created leadership position overseeing corporate ethics and workplace culture across the company's many divisions. Ethan declined almost immediately, uncomfortable with the idea of stepping into a world so unfamiliar to him, insisting quietly that he was simply a maintenance worker who had done what any decent person should have done, nothing more deserving of reward or elevated title. Victoria smiled at this response, unsurprised by his humility, and offered instead a different proposal, asking him not to accept an empty title, but to help her build a company where every employee, regardless of position, might be treated with the same fairness and dignity he had shown a stranger in a restaurant weeks earlier. This request Ethan could not refuse, because it asked nothing of him beyond continuing to be exactly who he already was, and he agreed to help her reshape the culture of an empire neither of them could have imagined connecting them just 1 month earlier. In the months that followed, Ethan settled into his new role gradually, uneasy at first amid the polished offices and confident executives who had spent entire careers navigating corporate hierarchies he had never studied, yet steady in his instincts about people and fairness, in a way formal education could never have taught anyone. He walked the floors of Sterling facilities, not as a distant executive issuing directives from behind glass walls, but as someone who remembered exactly what it felt like to be overlooked, underestimated, and treated as replaceable, and he used that memory to listen more carefully to workers whose voices had rarely reached leadership before his arrival. Employees who had once feared speaking honestly to management found in Ethan someone willing to sit beside them, hear their concerns without judgment, and act on legitimate grievances without the delays and dismissals so many had learned to expect from corporate life. Word of his fairness spread quickly through every division of the company, and within a surprisingly short time, morale across Sterling Global Holdings shifted in ways that even seasoned analysts struggled fully to explain in quarterly reports. He introduced a policy allowing any employee, regardless of rank, to request a direct conversation with leadership whenever a grievance went unresolved through normal channels. A simple change that unsettled several senior managers accustomed to operating without oversight, yet one that workers on loading docks and in call centers alike came to trust almost immediately. He remembered Walter's quiet loyalty during his own darkest weeks, and arranged, without publicity or announcement, for the older man's pension to be reviewed and corrected after discovering it had been miscalculated for years. A small act of justice that meant more to Walter than any speech ever could. He carried himself the same way he always had, refusing a larger office than necessary, taking his lunch in the common break rooms alongside warehouse staff rather than executive dining halls, and treating every janitor and every vice president with precisely the same unhurried attention. Victoria began inviting him into strategic meetings, not merely as a symbolic gesture, but because his instincts about people consistently proved sharper than the analysis produced by teams of expensive consultants, and executives who had once dismissed him as an unlikely hire slowly came to seek his opinion before finalizing major decisions. Charles Benton's failed company eventually collapsed under its own mismanagement within the year, a quiet consequence that arrived without any need for further intervention from Victoria, while Marcus Hale disappeared from the city's business circles entirely after word of his complicity spread through the same networks he had once used to climb. Victoria watched this transformation unfold with quiet satisfaction, recognizing that Ethan's presence had done for her company what no consultant or policy manual ever could, restoring a sense of humanity to an organization that had grown, over the years, increasingly distant from the people whose labor sustained its success. She found herself, too, growing closer to him personally with each passing week, their working partnership gradually deepening into something neither of them rushed nor forced, built instead on the same patient honesty that had defined their earliest conversations before either knew the other's true circumstances. They shared quiet dinners now without pretense, walked along the same harbor where Ethan had once worked unseen and unappreciated, and discovered together that respect, once genuinely earned between two people, tended to grow naturally into something far deeper without either of them needing to name it too quickly. One evening, many months after the day her identity had been revealed to an entire room of stunned executives, Victoria and Ethan walked together along the same waterfront, where he had spent so many exhausting years laboring in near anonymity. The autumn chill had softened into an early spring warmth by then, and the harbor lights reflected gently across calm water as the two of them walked slowly, unhurried, the distance between billionaire and dock worker having long since dissolved into something neither position nor money could measure any longer. Victoria stopped near the edge of the pier, turned to face him directly, and told him quietly that from the very night he had stood between her and a room full of cruelty, she had known, somehow, that she had finally encountered someone whose character matched the person she had always hoped to find beneath all the noise and performance of her ordinary life. Ethan looked at her for a long moment before answering, his voice carrying the same calm steadiness it always had, saying simply that he had done nothing extraordinary that night, only what any decent person, any soldier worth his training, should have done without needing to be asked or thanked. Victoria reached for his hand then, her fingers closing gently around his, and in that quiet gesture, every remaining distance between the world she had inherited and the life he had built from nothing seemed finally, completely, to disappear. They stood together at the edge of the pier as the sun began its slow descent behind the water, casting long gold light across the harbor that had once been merely a workplace to him, and was now, somehow, the place where his entire life had quietly and irreversibly changed. Neither of them spoke for a while, content simply to stand together in the fading light. Two people from vastly different worlds who had found, in each other, something far more valuable than either wealth or recognition had ever offered them separately. As the evening deepened into dusk, they turned and walked slowly back along the pier together, unhurried, unguarded, and entirely certain of the path now stretching ahead of them. In the years that followed, people who worked within Sterling Global Holdings often told a version of this story to new employees during their first week, less as gossip and more as a kind of quiet instruction about the values the company had come to represent. They spoke of a man who had given away nearly everything he owned for a stranger who needed nothing from him but decency, and of a woman who had learned, from that single unexpected act, what it truly meant to be seen for who she was, rather than what she possessed. Few of those newer employees ever learned every detail of that first night at the restaurant: the spilled wine, the mocking laughter, the folded bills placed quietly on a counter by a man in worn boots. Yet the values born from that evening had settled permanently into the culture of the company, long after the specifics faded into legend. Ethan never grew comfortable with attention, and even years later he deflected praise whenever someone recognized him from the story that occasionally resurfaced in local business circles, insisting always that he had simply done what needed doing on an ordinary evening like any other. Victoria, for her part, never stopped reminding him, in quiet moments between them, that ordinary evenings rarely produced extraordinary courage, and that the difference between the two rested entirely in the character of the person standing inside them. Walter eventually retired with the dignity and security he deserved, often stopping by the harbor to share coffee with the two of them, proud in his own quiet way to have known Ethan before the rest of the world had discovered what kind of man he truly was. The docks themselves changed too, slowly, as fair wages and better protections spread outward from policies Ethan had first insisted upon, until the same waterfront, where he had once been overlooked and underpaid, became known instead as a place where workers were treated with genuine respect. Men who once avoided his eyes during his darkest weeks eventually approached him again, some offering quiet apologies he never asked for, and always accepted without bitterness, because holding on to resentment had never once been part of the man Ethan Brooks chose to be. And so the harbor remained, through every season that followed, not merely a place of labor and commerce, but a living reminder that a single act of standing up for another person, offered freely and without calculation, could ripple outward far beyond anything either Ethan or Victoria could have imagined on the night they first met. What Ethan Brooks had given that night in the restaurant was never really about money, though it had cost him nearly everything he owned in that moment, and it was never really about recognition, since he never once expected any. It was, in the end, simply about the kind of person he had always chosen to be, in quiet rooms and public ones, in prosperity and in hardship, when someone was watching and especially when no one was. Victoria Sterling had spent years surrounded by people eager to earn her favor, yet it was a man with worn boots and an empty wallet who taught her, more than any advisor or executive ever had, what genuine decency actually looked like when it expected nothing in return. And so it became clear, to everyone who eventually learned their story, that the true measure of a person was never found in the size of their bank account or the title printed on their door, but in the simple, unglamorous choice to stand up for someone else, precisely when standing up cost the most and promised nothing at all in return.